The storm rolled in off the Wyoming plains like a living thing, black and furious and without mercy, and Hazel Merritt had exactly nowhere left to go. She had been riding for 2 days straight, her chestnut mare lathered and trembling beneath her, the wagon trail behind her swallowed up by sheets of rain so thick they looked like curtains drawn across a stage. The year was 1882, and Wyoming Territory was not a place that forgave the unprepared, and Hazel was painfully aware of just how unprepared she had allowed herself to become. She had left Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning with a carpet bag, a small tin of dried biscuits, $32 sewn into the hem of her skirt, and the kind of stubborn determination that her mother had always called a gift and her father had always called a curse. By Thursday evening, with lightning cracking the purple sky open like a dry walnut, she was beginning to suspect her father had been the wiser of the two. The settlement of Harlan's Crossing appeared through the downpour like a mirage, a cluster of low wooden buildings huddled together against the dark hillside as if for warmth. There was a general store, a livery, a squat building with a hand-painted sign that read Harlan's Saloon and Boarding, and several other structures of indeterminate purpose. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. Lantern light bled through shuttered windows. It was the most beautiful thing Hazel had seen in 48 hours. She rode her mare straight up the main street, if it could be called that, her hat plastered to her head by the rain, her coat soaked through to her skin. She dismounted at the hitching post in front of the boarding house, her legs unsteady after so long in the saddle, and she pushed through the door without ceremony. Inside, the room was warm and smoky and smelled of tobacco and boiled coffee and wet wool. There were 4 men sitting at a table playing cards, 2 women in the corner talking quietly over mugs of something hot, and behind a low counter at the far end of the room stood a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pulled back tight and eyes that assessed Hazel the way a horse trader assessed a questionable animal. "I need a room," Hazel said, pushing wet hair out of her face, "and a stall for my horse." The woman behind the counter, whose name turned out to be Dorothea Harlan, the widow of the settlement's founder, did not smile, but she did not frown either. She looked Hazel up and down with those calculating eyes, taking in the good quality of the ruined coat, the educated posture, the expensive but now thoroughly destroyed leather boots. "Last room just went," Dorothea said, and her voice was not unkind, just factual in the way of people who have delivered difficult news many times and no longer feel the need to cushion it. "Got 1 bunk left in the men's sleeping room, but that ain't suitable for a woman traveling alone. Bunk in the barn if you don't mind the horses." "The barn," Hazel repeated. "Storm's bad. You won't find better for 30 miles in any direction." Hazel looked around the room. The card players had not looked up. The 2 women in the corner were watching her with undisguised curiosity. The fire in the hearth crackled and spat, and the rain hammered the roof with something close to violence. She was about to say that the barn would have to do when the door behind her opened and brought in a fresh gust of cold, wet air and a man. He was tall, somewhere in his late 20s, with dark hair darkened further by rain, and a jawline that carried 3 days of stubble, and a certain quiet competence in the way he moved that made people in rooms instinctively give him space. He was wearing a battered canvas duster and worn boots and a hat that had seen better decades, and he was carrying a saddle over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. He stopped just inside the door and took in the room with the kind of calm, thorough look of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. His eyes settled on Hazel for a moment, then moved to Dorothea. "Evening. Need a bunk if you've still got one." "1 left," Dorothea said. "Men's room, $1 for the night." "That'll do." He set the saddle down against the wall and reached into his coat for the coin. Hazel turned to look at him fully then, because something about the easy economy of his movements caught her attention, and he must have felt her gaze because he turned his head and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was, she noticed with a small internal observation she immediately set aside, quite arrestingly handsome in a rough-hewn, unself-conscious way. "Were you just told the last bunk is in the men's room?" he asked her. "I was told the last room went," Hazel said, "and the option before the barn is a bunk in the men's sleeping room, which is not suitable." He studied her for a moment. The rain outside intensified, something she would not have thought possible, and something flickered across his expression. He looked at Dorothea. "She takes the bunk," he said simply. "I'll sort myself out." Dorothea raised an eyebrow. "Men's room ain't she takes the bunk," he said again, no argument in it, just quiet finality, and he set the dollar on the counter and pushed it toward Dorothea. "That's for her bunk. What does the barn cost?" Dorothea blinked at him. "2 bits for a stall." He reached into his pocket again and produced the coin without complaint. "Done." Hazel stared at him. "I cannot allow you to do that." He picked up his saddle and looked at her with an expression that was not exactly amused but had something of warmth in it, the way a fire has warmth even when it is small and careful. "You're not allowing me to do anything, ma'am. I'm choosing to do it. There's a difference." He touched the brim of his hat. "Sleep well." And then he walked back out into the rain. Hazel stood in the middle of the room staring at the door he had just gone through, while the rain went on making its fury known, and the fire went on crackling, and Dorothea Harlan went on watching her with those iron-gray eyes that now held a trace of something that might have been approval. "Who is that man?" Hazel asked. "Timothy Covington," Dorothea said. "Rides through here a few times a year. Works cattle, drives out of the basin. Good man." She paused. "Rare thing." Hazel went to the window and looked out toward the barn. She could see the flicker of a lantern through the gap in the barn doors, moving slowly, the way a man moves when he is settling in for the night without complaint. She went to bed in the clean, narrow bunk in the men's sleeping room, which was empty of all men since it appeared. She was the only one Dorothea had rooted this direction. And she lay on her back in the dark, listening to the rain and thinking about the kind of man who walks out of warmth and into a storm barn so that a stranger can sleep in a bed, and does it without making a ceremony of it. She did not sleep well. Not because the bunk was uncomfortable, because it was perfectly fine, but because she kept thinking about the barn. By midnight, the rain had not let up. If anything, it had grown louder, and wind had joined it. A low, mean wind that found every gap in the boarding house walls and made itself known. Hazel sat up in the bunk and held the rough blanket around her shoulders and thought about the barn again. She thought about the way he had said it. She takes the bunk. The way a man says something when it is not up for discussion, not because he is arrogant, but because he has already decided that it is simply the right thing to do, and arguing would waste both their time. She thought about the 2 bits he had paid without flinching. She thought about a man sleeping on straw while she had a pillow. She was out of the bunk and pulling on her coat before she had fully decided to do it. The walk to the barn in the rain was brief and deeply unpleasant. She held the lantern Dorothea had left burning in the hallway and ran across the muddy yard with her head down, and she pulled the barn door open and stepped inside and pushed it shut behind her. The barn smelled of horses and hay, and the warm animal smell of large bodies at rest. It was dim, lit by a single lantern hung on a post near the middle stalls. The horses shifted and snorted at her arrival. She walked past 3 of them, past a mule who watched her with profound indifference, and she found Timothy Covington at the far end of the barn, in the wide last stall, which he had clearly chosen because it had the most fresh hay. He had made himself a rough bed of it and was lying on his back with his hat over his face and his coat pulled up around him and his boots still on. "This is ridiculous," Hazel said. The hat came off his face. He looked at her, surprised in a way that he covered quickly, sitting up and looking at her standing in the barn doorway of the stall with the rain hammering the roof above them. "Miss Merritt," he said. She had given her name at the counter, she realized. He had heard it. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said again because it bore repeating. "You are sleeping on hay. I have a perfectly adequate bed. I don't know you, Mr. Covington, and I appreciate what you did, but I cannot simply lie in a warm bunk while you sleep in a horse stall." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight his eyes were darker than she had thought, a deep quiet brown, and they had an expression in them that was somewhere between amusement and something more careful and more genuine. "It's not the worst place I've slept," he said. "That is not the point." "What is the point?" "The point," she said, and she was aware that her voice had more feeling in it than she had intended, that something about this whole ridiculous evening, the rain and the road and the long 2 days of traveling, and now this stranger who had given up his bed without being asked, had worn through her composure in ways she had not expected. "The point is that you didn't have to do that and you did it anyway, and I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You could say thank you and go back to bed." She sat down on the hay a few feet from him, which surprised them both. "Tell me where you're headed," he said after a moment, not making anything of the fact that she had sat down, just accepting it the way he seemed to accept most things, with quiet steadiness. "Eastbrook," she said. "There's a school there. They've been advertising for a teacher. I've been teaching in Cheyenne for 3 years, but the school there is closing." She paused. "You?" "Heading up to the Haverford Ranch. They're putting together a cattle drive north before the season turns. I've ridden for them before." "You're a cowboy," she said. "I am," he said, without apology or particular pride, just as a statement of fact. "Been riding cattle since I was 17. How old are you now?" 28. She was 25, she told him, though he hadn't asked, and he nodded as if this information settled something he had been quietly wondering. They talked for a long time after that, there in the hay with the rain on the roof and the horses breathing softly around them and the single lantern casting its amber circle of warmth. She told him about Cheyenne, about the 3 years of teaching the children of miners and railroad men and ranchers, about the schoolmistress she had apprenticed under who had been fierce and funny, and had died of a fever the previous winter, about her own mother who had died when Hazel was 14 and her father who had remarried badly, and her decision at 20 to use her own savings to pay for her teaching certificate rather than wait for a man to decide her future for her. He listened. She noticed the quality of his listening, the way it was not the listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but the listening of someone genuinely attending to what was being said. He asked questions that proved he had heard her, small, precise questions that pulled threads she had not expected to pull. He told her about his own life in pieces, the way men of his kind often did, offering information not in a narrative but in fragments that she had to assemble herself. He had grown up in Missouri. His mother had died when he was 11. He had come west when he was 16, lying about his age to get work on a cattle drive, and had never really stopped. He had worked ranches from Texas to Montana. He had no permanent home and had not had one in years, and had reached a certain peace about that fact, or what he described as peace, though she thought she heard something under it that was not entirely peaceful. "Don't you want a home?" she asked him, and the question came out more direct than she intended, but she had been raised by a woman who believed in asking what she meant. He was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it," he said. "Just never had a reason that stuck." She did not say anything to that. The rain had begun to ease, she noticed, the hammering on the roof softening to something steadier and quieter. One of the horses exhaled with great feeling and the mule shifted its weight. "You should go back to the bunk," he said. "It's late." "You're right," she said, but she did not move immediately. She looked at him in the lamplight, at this man who had given up his bed for a stranger and then talked with her in a barn until near 1 in the morning as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she was not prepared to name yet but could not pretend was nothing. She stood. "Thank you, Mr. Covington, for the bunk and for the conversation." "Timothy," he said. "Covington is what they call me when I'm in trouble." She smiled, the first full smile she had managed in 2 days. "Good night, Timothy." "Good night, Miss Merritt." She went back through the rain to the boarding house and lay in the bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought that Wyoming Territory was a very strange and surprising place. In the morning, the storm was gone and the world was washed clean and brilliant, the way the world always looks the morning after a hard rain, as if it has been given another chance. Hazel dressed quickly and went down to the main room where Dorothea Harlan was producing eggs and cornbread and strong coffee, with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding travelers for 20 years. Timothy was already there, sitting at the far end of the long table with a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, his hat on the bench beside him, his dark hair still damp. He looked up when she came in and something shifted in his expression, a small, contained warmth, and he nodded. She took the bench across from him, which was either perfectly natural or completely deliberate, and she was not sure which it was herself. "The road to Eastbrook," she said, settling her skirt around her. "Do you know it?" "Some of it," he said. "I'll be riding east for about 20 miles before I turn north. Road to Eastbrook follows the river canyon for the first stretch." Dorothea set a plate in front of Hazel. "Road's passable," she said, "but there's mud slides up by the canyon wall. Heard it from 2 riders this morning already. Solo travel is not smart." Hazel looked at Timothy. Timothy looked at Hazel. "I could ride with you to the canyon junction," he said, in a tone that suggested this was a practical offer and nothing more, though his eyes said something that was perhaps a shade more complex. "Road splits there. You'd be through the worst stretch." "I would not want to delay you," Hazel said. "Half a day," he said. "Haverford can spare me half a day." They rode out together an hour later, their horses falling into an easy rhythm side by side on the muddy trail, the Wyoming morning opening up around them in gold and green, and the smell of sage washed clean by rain. Hazel's mare, whose name was Clover, seemed to take an immediate fondness for Timothy's gray gelding, which Timothy called Rook, and this seemed to Hazel like either a coincidence or a small, gentle joke from the universe. The canyon road was everything Dorothea had warned about and more. The trail was narrow and slick, pressed between the canyon wall on one side and a drop to the river on the other, and twice they had to dismount and lead the horses around fresh falls of rock and mud that had come down in the night. Timothy moved through these obstacles with steady, unhurried competence, checking the ground before he stepped on it, guiding Rook with a hand on the bridle, holding a hand back for Hazel to take when the path required it. She took his hand the first time without thinking. The second time she was very aware of taking it, of the warmth and the calluses and the steadiness of his grip, and she was aware too of the moment when the path widened, and they could have separated, but neither of them immediately did. They talked while they rode, picking up the conversation from the barn the night before as if it had never been set down. She asked him about the cattle drives, and he described them with the kind of precise affection that a person has for something that has shaped them, the scale of the herds, the dust and the noise of it, the particular silence of nights on the open plain with thousands of cattle breathing around you and the stars overhead so thick they seemed like something you could reach up and touch. He described a river crossing he had done in Texas where the water was up, and the cattle were panicking, and 3 cowboys had ridden into the river to turn the lead steers, and how the whole mass of animals had wheeled and come back to the bank as if they had decided together, and the relief of it, the sudden quiet after that much sound and fear. She told him about her students, the one she had loved best, a boy named Elias who had come to her at 8 years old unable to read a word, and had left at 11 reading everything he could get his hands on, who had written her a letter 2 years later to tell her he had been hired to keep accounts for a mining company. She talked about the girl, Clara, who had drawn pictures in the margins of every assignment but whose arithmetic was perfect, and how Hazel had eventually stopped correcting the drawings and started asking about them instead. She talked about the particular weight of being responsible for children in a place where children were often overlooked, where schools were underfunded and underrespected, and where parents sometimes pulled their children out of school to work when the season demanded it. And she talked about fighting for those children with paperwork and with persistence, and once, memorably, with a long and ill-tempered conversation with the Cheyenne School board chairman, who had told her the school could manage with fewer books, and she had told him with great composure that it absolutely could not. Timothy listened to all of it with the same quality of attention he had given her the night before, and when she finished he said, You're going to be good for Eastbrook." And the simplicity of it caught her somewhere in the chest. They reached the canyon junction at midday. The river ran clear and fast below them, still swollen from the storm, and the trail forked here, one path continuing east toward Eastbrook, the other turning north into the open grazing country where the Haverford Ranch spread across the high plain. They stopped their horses, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Half a day," Hazel said. "You said it would be half a day." "It is exactly half a day," he said. "You should get on to Haverford's." "I should," he agreed. He was looking at her in a way that was direct without being presumptuous, the kind of look that said, "I am seeing you clearly and I am not pretending otherwise. Will you be all right the rest of the way?" "The road is open and flat from here," she said. "I'll be fine." "Eastbrook is about 8 miles," he said. "There's a good boarding house there, the Whitfield place. Tell Mary Whitfield that Timothy Covington sent you. She'll give you a good rate." Hazel looked at him. "You know people in Eastbrook." "I know people in most places," he said. "Spent enough years riding through them." She looked at him for a long moment, aware of the junction behind them and the roads going in 2 directions and the river below and the open sky above, and the particular quality of this moment, this crossroads that was both literal and something else she was not quite ready to examine directly. "The cattle drive," she said. "When does it end?" Something in his expression shifted, became more careful and more present at the same time. "End of October," he said. 6 weeks, maybe 7. "Eastbrook is 30 miles from Haverford's ranch," she said. She had studied the maps in Cheyenne before she left. "It is," he said. "I will be at the Whitfield boarding house," she said, "until I can find suitable permanent lodging. Once I'm settled at the school, I imagine I'll be there for some time." He looked at her steadily. "Is that so?" "It is so," she said. She held out her hand the way a man would, straight and serious. "It was a genuine pleasure to meet you, Timothy Covington." He looked at her hand for a moment, then took it, but he did not shake it the way she'd intended. He held it for a moment, just held it, as if testing the weight of it, and his eyes came up to hers, and the warmth in them was no longer contained or careful but open and clear. "Likewise, Hazel Merritt," he said. "Likewise." She rode east toward Eastbrook, and she did not let herself look back. But she was smiling all the way to the river crossing, and she was still smiling when Eastbrook appeared through the cottonwood trees at 4 in the afternoon, small and solid, and full of the particular promise of a new beginning. The Eastbrook schoolhouse was a single-room building with 4 windows, and a wood stove and benches that needed new legs on 2 of them, and a blackboard that needed fresh chalk. And Hazel loved it immediately with the uncomplicated love of someone who has found the place where they are meant to be. The school board chairman, a Mr. Abernathy, was a red-faced man with mutton-chop whiskers who had clearly expected someone older, and was not sure what to make of a 25-year-old woman who arrived with a carpet bag and a firm handshake, and a list of supplies she would need in the first 2 weeks written on paper she produced from her coat pocket before he had finished introducing himself. "You certainly came prepared," he said, looking at the list. "I find preparation saves considerable time for everyone," Hazel said pleasantly, which was her method of moving past his uncertainty without letting it become her problem. Mary Whitfield, at the boarding house Timothy had mentioned, turned out to be a woman of about 40 with sharp dark eyes and an unexpectedly warm laugh, who did indeed give Hazel a good rate when she mentioned the name, and who also said, without Hazel having asked, "Timothy Covington is a good man. One of the genuinely good ones. I've known him since he came through here in '79 and helped my husband pull 2 of our horses out of a flooded creek and refused to take a cent for it." "What sort of man does that?" Hazel asked. Mary looked at her with those sharp eyes. "The right sort," she said. Hazel settled into Eastbrook with the focused efficiency of a woman who has always had to make her own way. She cleaned the schoolhouse from top to bottom the first week. She repaired 2 bench legs herself with wood and nails she purchased from the general store, which caused the storekeeper, a Mr. Prout, to say that he had never sold lumber to a schoolteacher before, and she said that she imagined there was a first time for everything. She organized the existing books, thin and dog-eared as they were, into a proper lending system, and wrote to the Cheyenne Teacher Supply Company for new primers and arithmetic books, paying for them herself when Mr. Abernathy was slow to approve the funds. She began teaching on the 1st of September, 19 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, the children of ranchers and storekeepers and a blacksmith and the town doctor, and, she noticed, a number of children who arrived in clothes too thin for the turning season. She made a note of this and spoke to Mary Whitfield about it, and Mary, who knew everyone in Eastbrook and the surrounding country, quietly organized a collection of winter coats through the church that arrived the second week of September with enough for every child who needed one and several left over. Hazel thought about Timothy Covington more than she had expected to. She thought about him during the long evenings at the boarding house, when Mary's other boarders had gone to bed, and the house was quiet and Hazel sat at the table in the parlor grading arithmetic papers by lamplight. She thought about the barn and the rain and the hay and the quality of his listening. She thought about the canyon road and the 2 times he had offered his hand and the way he had held hers at the junction, not as a handshake but as something else she had not been able to precisely name but had not been able to stop thinking about either. She wrote him a letter. She rewrote it twice. She addressed it to Timothy Covington, care of the Haverford Ranch, in the basin north of Eastbrook, which was as specific as she could be. She did not know if it would reach him. She told herself it was the sort of friendly correspondence one maintained with a person who had done one a kindness. She told herself this until it almost sounded true. The letter said, "I hope the drive is going well and that the weather has been kinder north of here than it was in Harlan's Crossing. Eastbrook is a good town, and the children are wonderful. 2 of the bench legs in the schoolhouse needed replacing and I have replaced them, which I mention because I thought you would find it either funny or impressive, and I cannot decide which. I told Mary Whitfield you sent me and she says you are a good man. I think she is right. Hazel Merritt. She sent it on a Tuesday. She received a letter back on a Friday that she opened at the kitchen table while Mary pretended not to notice. The letter was not long and was written in a hand that was clear and careful in a way that suggested a man who had not had much formal education, but had worked at his letters with deliberate attention. It said, "The drive is hard, but the weather has been good since the storm, which is a mercy. I'm glad Eastbrook is what you hoped for. Replacing bench legs yourself sounds exactly like you based on what I know of you, which is admittedly based on one storm and one morning, but some things about a person you can see right away. Tell Mary Whitfield I said hello. Come October I expect to ride through. Timothy Covington. Come October." Hazel put the letter in the tin box where she kept her important papers, next to her teaching certificate and her mother's photograph, and she went back to grading arithmetic papers with a feeling in her chest that she was no longer entirely willing to call something other than what it was. October in Wyoming Territory came down hard, the way it does, with cold nights and brilliant days, and the aspen going yellow on the hillsides, and the smell of wood smoke everywhere from breakfast until dark. Hazel had settled so thoroughly into Eastbrook by now that she had moved from the Whitfield boarding house into a small 2-room house on the edge of town that Mr. Abernathy had made available, somewhat grudgingly, as part of her teaching arrangement. She had furnished it simply but carefully: a good stove, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a bookshelf she had commissioned from the Eastbrook carpenter, a quiet man named Hendricks, who had built it to her specifications and charged her less than she had expected and seemed embarrassed when she praised it. She had told Mary Whitfield her new address, and she had written this address in a second letter to Timothy Covington without explaining why she wanted him to have it, and he had not in his brief reply asked why, which she thought said something about him. He arrived on the 14th of October on a clear, cold morning when the cottonwoods along the main street were blazing yellow and the air had the sharp, clean smell of the first real cold of the season. She was walking back from the schoolhouse with a stack of papers under her arm when she saw the gray gelding tied at the post outside the general store, and she stopped walking entirely. She was still standing on the boardwalk with her papers when Timothy Covington came out of the general store with a paper parcel under his arm and nearly walked into her. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other. He looked the same and also different, she thought. Leaner perhaps from weeks on the trail. The stubble was a full beard now, though a neat one. He had new bruising along his jaw that had faded to the yellow-green of an old injury, and she wanted to ask about it but did not yet. His eyes were the same, that quiet deep brown, and they had the same warmth in them that she remembered, but there was something else now, something that moved through them when he looked at her that was less contained than it had been in Harlan's Crossing. "Miss Merritt," he said. "You said October," she said. "I did," he said. "You're early," she said. "It's only the 14th. The drive finished ahead of schedule," he said. The weather cooperated for once. They stood on the boardwalk in the October morning with the yellow leaves falling around them and the papers under her arm and the parcel under his, and she thought this was either the most natural thing in the world or the most extraordinary, and it was both at once, and she was suddenly, fully, and completely aware of how much she had been looking forward to this moment. "Would you like to come to dinner?" she said. "I have a house now. It has 2 chairs, and I made a beef stew yesterday that is better than it has any right to be given my available ingredients." Something in his face softened in a way that made him look younger and also more himself somehow, more entirely Timothy Covington, and less the capable, self-contained man he presented to the world. "Yes," he said, "I would like that very much." They walked to her small house at the edge of town, and she put the stew on to reheat while he sat in one of her 2 chairs and looked around the room with evident approval, the bookshelf and the tidy table and the curtains she had sewn from fabric she found at Prute's store, blue with small white flowers. "You made it yours," he said. "I try to make things mine," she said. "It's a habit." He came to dinner that evening and stayed talking until the fire burned low, and he came back the next morning and walked her to the schoolhouse and waited outside until she was done and walked her back. And on the 3rd day he was still in Eastbrook, and the cattle drive was finished, and the Haverford ranch did not need him again until spring. And Hazel asked Mary Whitfield over coffee what she knew about Timothy Covington's plans, and Mary looked at her with those sharp dark eyes and said, "I think his plans depend on you, Hazel. I think they have since Harlan's Crossing." He took her riding on the 4th day, out along the river trail south of town, where the canyon opened into wide pasture, and the cattle on the hillside stood like dark marks on gold, and they rode side by side in the cool morning with their breath showing, and they talked about everything and nothing. He told her about the cattle drive, about a night when lightning had spooked the entire herd, and they had ridden hard for 2 hours keeping the animals from scattering into the dark, and the bruise on his jaw was from a steer that had turned at close range and caught him with its horn. She told him about her students, about Elias, and about a girl named Ruth who had arrived at the schoolhouse speaking only Lakota, and had sat in silent dignity for 3 weeks before beginning to learn English with a speed and intensity that amazed everyone. And Hazel had been researching how to communicate better with Ruth and had been writing to a missionary teacher in the North who knew the language. "That's more than most would do," Timothy said. "It's what the job requires," she said. But she knew it was also more than the job required, and she knew he knew it too. They stopped on a rise above the river where the view opened up across the whole wide valley, and he looked at it for a moment in silence. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what I said in Harlan's Crossing, about not having a reason that stuck." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, not at her, but his jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as the way he looked when he was saying something that mattered to him. "I think," he said carefully, as if the words were something he was measuring, "that I was wrong to say I'd never had a reason. I think I'd had reasons before that turned out to be not quite right, not the real thing." He paused. "And I think when the real thing is right in front of you it's foolish not to say so." He turned and looked at her then fully, with those open dark eyes and all the warmth in them that she had been trying not to name for 6 weeks. "Hazel," he said, just her name, and in his voice it was the most complete sentence she had ever heard. "Timothy," she said, just his name back, and she watched the warmth in his eyes deepen into something that was very close to relief, the way a man looks when he has been carrying something a long way and has finally been told he can set it down. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission." She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "I was beginning to wonder if you were going to get around to asking." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him really laugh, unguarded and full, and it transformed his face entirely, made him look like what he was, a young man who had been very serious for a very long time and had just been given permission to be something more than serious. "I was getting around to it," he said. "You were doing it very slowly," she said. "I was being thorough," he said, and he was still smiling and she was smiling, and the river below them caught the morning sun and threw it back in pieces, and the yellow cottonwoods shook in a light wind, and she thought she had not been this happy in a very long time. He stayed in Eastbrook. This itself was a thing, the staying. He found work at a nearby ranch as a hand, helping with the late-season work, the fence mending and the wood cutting and the general labor that small ranches needed in the weeks before the hard winter set in. And the rancher, a stocky man named Bowen who had a perpetual squint and an unexpectedly generous nature, gave Timothy the use of a small cabin on the property in exchange for work. It was 2 miles from Eastbrook, close enough to ride in easily. He was at Hazel's door on Sunday mornings with fresh bread he had learned to make in a cast-iron skillet over the cabin stove, which she found so genuinely touching and funny. A man who rode cattle for a living baking bread in a skillet, that she told him she would have fallen in love with him for the bread alone if everything else had not already accomplished it. The word fell out before she had intended it to. She felt the air in the small kitchen go very still. He was standing at her table setting the bread down and he went very still himself, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something completely unguarded, something raw and careful and enormous. "Say that again," he said quietly. "I didn't mean to say it yet," she said. "It came out." "Say it again anyway," he said. She looked at him across the small kitchen in the October morning light. This man who had given her his bed in a rainstorm and ridden a dangerous canyon road to see her safely through and written her careful, measured letters and come back in October as he had said and walked with her every day and made bread in a skillet and looked at her with those dark eyes that held everything she had ever wanted to find in another person. "I love you," she said, clearly, without qualification. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands, hands that were warm and strong and gentle, and he kissed her with a thoroughness that was entirely consistent with everything she knew about the way he did things, and when he stepped back his expression was the most open and unprotected thing she had ever seen on a human face. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you walked into that barn in the rain and told me sleeping in hay was ridiculous." "It was ridiculous," she said. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said. Eastbrook's autumn turned to winter, and the winter was hard the way Wyoming winters are hard, with snow that came in November and stayed, with cold that made the windows frost on the inside, and the road to town a thing requiring full planning. Hazel kept the schoolhouse fire burning all day, and one of the older boys, a 14-year-old named Jonas who was the son of the blacksmith, took it upon himself to come early each morning to start the fire before she arrived, which she appreciated and told him so in the particular way she had of praising students that made them stand taller without becoming prideful about it. Timothy rode in from the Bowen place every few days, wrapped in his canvas duster and a wool scarf that Hazel had knitted for him, imperfectly but warmly, and which he wore without the slightest self-consciousness. He would sit by her fire and grade papers with her sometimes, not knowing the subjects but being able to tell her if handwriting was legible or if an explanation made logical sense, which she found surprisingly useful, and he would tell her about the ranch work, the slow, important labor of a winter ranch, the livestock checks and the feed, the repairs that could only be done when the animals were close and easy to observe. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday evening in December, sitting across from her at her small kitchen table with the fire going and snow falling outside, and the papers graded and put aside and 2 cups of coffee between them, and he asked it without drama, leaning forward on the table and looking at her with complete directness. "I want to marry you, Hazel," he said. "I want to stay in Eastbrook and build something here with you. I've been thinking about land. Bowen says there's a piece of ground 2 miles south of the Whitfield place that could be had reasonably, good water, and enough room for a house and a small ranch operation. I could build the house. I have enough saved. I want to know if you'll marry me." She looked at him across the table with all the feeling of the last 3 months pressing up against the inside of her chest. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." "Obviously," he said, and his smile broke across his face like something he had been holding back, wide and unguarded and beautiful. Mary Whitfield cried when they told her, which she denied immediately afterward, pressing her fingers to her eyes and saying it was the cold air from the open door, and no one in the room believed her. Mr. Abernathy, when informed, said he hoped Miss Merritt did not intend to leave the school, because he had an opinion that married women ought to keep their professional commitments, or what was the point of training anyone, which Hazel found so entirely backwards from the usual sentiment that she was briefly speechless before agreeing wholeheartedly. The land Timothy had described was exactly as he had said, a piece of good flat ground south of town, with a creek running through it and cottonwood trees along the east side, and a small rise to the west that blocked the worst of the north wind. He put a deposit on it in January and spent the winter mornings, when the weather permitted, walking the ground and thinking about where the house would sit. He asked her to come and stand on the rise with him one Sunday afternoon, cold as it was, and he showed her where the house would face, and where the barn would be, and where the kitchen garden would go when the ground thawed, and she stood in the snow in her good wool coat listening to him describe a future with such clarity and quiet conviction that something in her that had been careful and self-reliant for a very long time, out of necessity, out of the particular kind of self-protection that a woman on her own in the world learns to maintain, came quietly and thoroughly undone. "You've thought about it in detail," she said. "I think about most things in detail," he said. "Comes from years of cattle work. You plan the drive before the drive or the drive plans you. The house faces south," she noted. "For the light," he said. "You'd want light for your books and for the children's lessons if we're schooling them at home some evenings." She turned to look at him. "You've been thinking about children." "I've been thinking about everything," he said simply. "I think about you every morning first, and then I think about everything else." She took his arm and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the snow on the rise and looked at the land that was going to be theirs. And she thought that happiness was, when it came down to it, not a complicated thing. It was this. It was a person beside you who saw you clearly and was not afraid of you, who planned for your light and thought about your books and was content to stand in the cold with you looking at a future taking shape. They married in April. The ceremony was held in the Eastbrook Church, a small white building with a bell that the congregation rang with apparent competitive enthusiasm on every possible occasion. The minister was a young man named Reverend Pell, who had been in Eastbrook less than a year, and approached his ministerial duties with the nervous earnestness of someone trying very hard to do a job well. He performed the ceremony with both great feeling and occasional loss of his place in the service, which only made everyone like him more. Hazel wore her best dress, a blue wool that she had ordered from the Cheyenne dry goods catalog in February, and which had arrived in March, and which she had altered herself to fit correctly. Mary Whitfield had threaded white ribbon through her hair. The children from the school were seated in the front rows, because she had told them they were invited, and they had arrived en masse in their Sunday best with the solemn attentiveness of people who understood this was an important event. Timothy wore a new suit. He had bought it in Cheyenne on a trip he had taken specifically for this purpose, a dark charcoal wool, and he stood at the front of the church looking like what he was, a capable, honest, thoroughly good man standing at the edge of the best thing that had ever happened to him. And when Hazel walked down the aisle on the arm of Mr. Bowen, who had volunteered for the role with surprising graciousness, Timothy looked at her the way she had first looked at the settlement of Harlan's crossing through the rain, with the expression of someone who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just found it in a place they had not expected. The ring was simple, a gold band he had had made by the jeweler in Cheyenne, and when he slid it onto her finger his hands were entirely steady, and his voice was entirely steady when he said his vows, and she could feel the steadiness of him through the ring and through her hands, and she thought that steadiness, real steadiness, the kind that comes not from absence of feeling but from the presence of something deeper than feeling, was the most romantic thing in the world. They built the house through the spring and summer. Timothy did much of the work himself, with help from Bowen and from Jonas, the blacksmith's son who turned out to have a genuine aptitude for carpentry, and whom Timothy taught as they worked with the same quality of attention that Hazel recognized from her own teaching. The house grew from a frame to walls to a roof, and then to something you could stand inside of and begin to imagine living in. And through all of it Hazel came out on Saturdays and Sundays to see its progress and to bring food and coffee, and occasionally to hold boards while things were hammered, though she also sometimes just sat on the rise and watched the house go up against the Wyoming sky and felt something so complete and grateful it had no words she knew of. The bookshelf from Hendricks went in first. Timothy carried it in himself on the day they moved in and set it against the south wall under the window that faced the light, and he looked at her when he straightened up, and she walked over and stood beside it and ran her hand along the empty wood that was already waiting for everything she had. "The books go in today," she said. "The books go in today," he agreed. They filled it that afternoon, unpacking crates with the easy companionable efficiency of two people who had already learned how to be in a space together. And by evening the shelf was full, and the house had a fire going in the new stove, and 2 cups of tea on the table, and the sound of the creek outside, and the last of the spring light coming through the south window, across the room, and across all the books, and across Timothy's face, where he sat reading with the same quiet attention he gave to everything. And Hazel sat across from him, thinking that this was not something she had been given. It was something she had found, through a storm and a barn and a canyon road and 6 weeks of letters and October and bread in a skillet and a rise above the snow. And it was entirely hers and entirely his and entirely real. The first year in the house brought the particular education of learning to truly share a life with another person, not just the romantic parts but the ordinary and sometimes difficult parts, the disagreements about practical things, the adjustments of habit and schedule, the discovering of qualities in each other that had not been fully visible before. She discovered that Timothy had a temper in the way that quiet people sometimes do, not explosive but compressed, a tight silence when something frustrated him that she learned to read and to give space to until it passed. He discovered that Hazel had a particular stubbornness when she believed she was right that was more formidable than anything he had encountered in years of cattle work, a calm, absolute refusal to move that she could maintain indefinitely. They navigated these things with honesty and with the willingness to say directly when something was difficult, which was not always comfortable, but was always more productive than the alternative. There was an argument in August about money, specifically about Hazel's teaching salary and how it should be managed, and Hazel said clearly that her salary was her own, and she would manage it herself and contribute to the household as she chose. And Timothy was quiet for a moment, and then said that he thought she was entirely right, and that he should not have implied otherwise, and she loved him for that. for the willingness to correct himself without making the correction into a greater event than the original error. She taught through the fall with a particular joy that she thought must have been visible to her students because Jonas, who was 14 and thus old enough to have opinions, told her one afternoon that she seemed happy, and she thanked him and he turned red and went back to his arithmetic. She was expecting their first child by Christmas of that first year. She told Timothy on a Sunday morning by the fire, simply watching his face, and his face did the thing it did when something moved him deeply, went very still first and then came apart into an expression of such open, unprotected feeling that she always felt she was seeing the truest version of him. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. He got up from his chair and crossed to where she was sitting and knelt beside her in a way that was not theatrical but was just the instinct of a man trying to be physically close to something enormously important, and he put his hand against her face and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you frightened?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm not frightened. I'm very happy." He said nothing more for a moment, just held her face, and she could feel in his hands everything he was not saying, all the size of it. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now sit back down and have your coffee. The morning is not getting younger." He sat back down and he was smiling in the way she loved best, the wide, unguarded smile. And he drank his coffee and the fire burned and the snow fell outside and the house was warm and solid around them. The son was born in July of 1884, a healthy, loud, opinionated baby who arrived in the world with the apparent intention of making his presence fully known, and who was named Daniel James Covington after Timothy's father and Hazel's father, both of them men who had done their imperfect best, which she believed was worthy of remembrance. He had Timothy's dark hair and her green eyes, and from his very first week, he looked at the world with an expression of absolute determination to understand it that made Hazel think he might give them both a very interesting time of it. Timothy held his son for the first time with the same careful steadiness he applied to everything, and looked at him with an expression that was entirely new, not the warmth of a man in love with a woman, but the deeper, different warmth of a man in love with a child, protective and wondering and terrified in the good way. "He's small," Timothy said. "He will not always be small," Hazel said from the bed. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Mary Whitfield came to meet Daniel the next day and cried again, more openly this time, and did not blame it on the weather. Life on the Covington place settled into the rhythms of a working ranch and a teaching household, and these rhythms were full and sometimes exhausting and frequently beautiful. Timothy expanded the ranch operation gradually, adding cattle through the second and third years, building a proper barn to replace the original small shelter, fencing the creek pasture. He worked hard in the particular way of a man who is building something for reasons that go beyond himself, with a sense of purpose that made the work different from the work he had done for hire in the years before. Hazel taught through all of it, adjusting her schedule after Daniel's birth with Mary Whitfield's help, and the help of a young woman named Cora who came from a farm east of town and took care of Daniel on the teaching days. She taught the children of Eastbrook with the same fierce, committed attention she had always brought to it, and over the years, her school became known in the surrounding country as the kind of place that produced students who could think, which she considered the highest possible compliment. She also became, by the natural process of being the most educated person in a town that needed things handled, involved in wider matters. She wrote letters to the territorial government about the inadequate school funding. She organized a small lending library in the schoolhouse that grew over the years into something that could properly be called a collection. She corresponded with other teachers across the territory, sharing methods and problems and solutions, and her letters were known among that small community of women educators to be worth reading. She also, as the years went on, became more active in what she could see happening around Eastbrook that required addressing. Wyoming Territory was changing through the 80s. the cattle industry growing and sometimes overwhelming the smaller operations, the fencing of open range creating conflicts between the large outfits and the small ranchers and settlers who had been there first. She saw families lose their homesteads through legal maneuvers that were technically valid and morally dubious. She saw the children of those families arrive at school thinner than they had been the previous fall. She wrote about these things to the Cheyenne newspapers, using her own name, because she believed that signing your name to what you believed was the only honest way to say what you believed. Timothy read her letters before she sent them and said very little except once, when she had written a particularly pointed piece about a large cattleman who was using his political connections to block the water rights of smaller operations. He read it and looked up at her. "You know people will come to me about this," he said. "They are welcome to," she said. "You know the McCleary outfit will not like it." "The McCleary outfit is wrong," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Send it." She sent it. There were some uncomfortable months afterward during which several of the larger ranch interests in the region were noticeably cool to the Covingtons, and once there was a tense conversation at the general store between Timothy and a McCleary foreman that did not come to violence but was not entirely comfortable. Timothy handled it with his usual controlled steadiness and came home and told her about it without making it either larger or smaller than it was. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm fine," he said. He's not happy, but unhappy powerful men are not a new problem in the world. "I'm sorry if it made things harder for you," she said. He looked at her. "Don't be," he said. "You were right. You're almost always right about these things." "I'm not always right," she said. "You're right more often than most people," he said, and he meant it as the serious, unconditional compliment it was. Daniel grew. By the time he was 4, he was following his father around the ranch with the absolute focused devotion of a small person who has decided that another person is the most interesting thing in the world. And Timothy bore this with a patience and a delight that Hazel watched from the kitchen window and the schoolhouse, and the rise above the creek with the feeling that some things were so good they did not quite feel real and yet were entirely, solidly real. The second child was a girl born in 1886 and named Rose, which was Hazel's choice after her mother's name. She arrived more quietly than Daniel had, with a watchfulness that she maintained through her whole early childhood, taking in the world with large, serious eyes that looked exactly like Timothy's. She was, from very early, a child who listened, who absorbed things, who made fewer sounds than her brother but was, Hazel suspected, processing more. Timothy said she was like her mother. Hazel said she was like her father. They were both right. The years settled into the particular beauty of a life that is genuinely good, not because it is free of difficulty, but because the difficulty is shared, and the joy is shared, and the two people sharing both things are committed to each other in a way that is not contingent on things going well. There were hard years, a drought year and a winter that took several of the cattle and required them to be careful with money in ways that reminded Hazel of leaner times. And there was a year when Daniel was sick in the spring with a fever that frightened them both badly and lasted 2 weeks and resolved, thank God, without lasting damage. There was the year she had a difficult pregnancy that did not go to term, and the grief of that was real and Timothy's quiet presence through. It was the only thing that made it manageable. The way he did not try to fix it or minimize it but simply stayed, right there, in every room she moved through, steady as the creek outside and the hills above it. And there were the good years, the years when everything worked, when the ranch was profitable and the school was thriving and the children were well, and she and Timothy rode out together on Sunday afternoons, the way they had from the beginning, along the river trail or up onto the high plain where the grass went on in every direction, and the sky over Wyoming was bigger than anything else on earth. Daniel was 8 when Hazel found him reading from the shelf in the front room, not the children's primers she had arranged at his level, but one of her history books, a thick volume about the westward expansion that she herself had found difficult in places. He was lying on his stomach on the braided rug with the book open in front of him, and his face bent close to the page and his finger moving along the lines. And when she came in, he looked up and said, without preamble, "Mother, did you know that the people who were here before us didn't have a choice about what happened to them?" She sat down on the floor beside him, not in a chair but on the floor beside him where he was, which he accepted as entirely normal because she had always done it, come down to his level for the important conversations. "I know," she said. "It is one of the most important things to know." "It was wrong," he said, with the clear moral certainty of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to make things complicated that are actually simple. "It was wrong," she agreed. "And it still affects many people, including some people you know." He thought about this. "Ruth," he said, naming the girl who had been her student years before and who was now a young woman who sometimes visited when she was near Eastbrook. "Ruth," Hazel confirmed. "And many others." He went back to his book. She stayed on the floor beside him for a while and thought about him growing up in this house, on this land, with this kind of education, and she thought about the kind of man he might become. And she was hopeful in a way she had not expected to be hopeful, the specific hopeful of a woman who has put good things into the world and is watching them take root. Timothy found them there when he came in from the evening work, both of them on the floor with the history book between them, and he stood in the doorway and looked at them with an expression that was entirely open and entirely unguarded, and he said, "Am I interrupting a lesson?" "We're discussing history," Hazel said. "Important history," Daniel said, not looking up from the page. Timothy came in and sat on the floor too, his back against the chair, and he said, "Tell me what you've learned." And Daniel told him with 8-year-old exactness, and Timothy listened with the complete attention that was the most distinctly himself thing about him, the attention that had first shown itself in a barn in a rainstorm in 1882 and had not once diminished in the years since. Rose was 4 and already reading, which startled Mr. Abernathy when he heard it and surprised no one who knew either of her parents, and she sat in the corner with her own picture book, and the fire was going and the lamp was burning, and the smell of supper was still in the warm air, and this was their life. In the spring of 1889, Wyoming was moving toward statehood, and with it came all the debates and contests and arguments that accompanied any major change in the structure of how people were governed. Hazel followed these developments with close attention, writing more letters, speaking at the small public meetings that Eastbrook organized, contributing her particular brand of clear-eyed analysis to the community's collective thinking. She was part of the group that pushed for Wyoming's continued support of women's suffrage, which Wyoming Territory had granted in 1869, and which was not guaranteed to continue in the transition to statehood, and she brought to this advocacy the same organized determination she brought to everything. Timothy came to the public meetings. He sat in the back and listened, and when people said things that were wrong, he said, quietly and with specifics, why they were wrong, and people tended to listen to him because he had the reputation of a man who chose his words carefully, and therefore the words he chose were worth attending to. "You're becoming a civic figure," she told him one evening. "I'm becoming someone's husband," he said. "It has expanded my interests." "I expanded your interests." "You expanded everything," he said simply. Wyoming became a state in July of 1890 and retained women's suffrage, and Hazel sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper from Cheyenne that carried the news and read it through twice and then looked at Timothy across the table. "Progress," she said. "Slow progress," he said. "But progress." "Slow is still progress," she said. He raised his coffee cup in a toast, and she raised hers, and they drank to slow progress in the morning light in their house on the creek 2 miles south of Eastbrook. And outside the window the summer was fully arrived, and the cottonwoods were green, and Daniel was somewhere in the yard shouting at the chickens, and Rose was on the porch with her book, and everything was exactly what they had built it to be. There was a third child, a boy they named Samuel, born in 1891, and he came into the world looking like Hazel, with her coloring and her face and Timothy's eyes in her face, which created an arresting combination that made people who met him look twice. He was the loudest of the three children by some distance, with opinions about everything from his first year onward, and Timothy said privately to Hazel that he thought Samuel had gotten both their stubborn sides combined into a single child, which she did not deny. The ranch was genuinely successful by the early 90s. Timothy had built it carefully, resisting the temptation to overextend during the boom years, and when the cattle market contracted in 92, he had enough flexibility to weather it where some of his neighbors did not. He helped two of those neighbors, quietly and without making a display of it, extending credit terms on materials they owed him, and in one case simply forgiving a debt when he understood the family would not recover from it otherwise. Hazel found out about the forgiven debt from Mary Whitfield, who found out everything, and when she asked him about it, he said only that the family had children and the debt was money he did not need. "You are a good man," she said. "You've been told that before," he said, meaning that she had been told it about him by Mary Whitfield 10 years ago. "I was told correctly," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen with the expression that she knew meant he was feeling something large and was containing it in his characteristic way. "I've been fortunate," he said. "Some of the goodness is just luck. Some of the goodness is you," she said firmly. "Accept it." He smiled. "All right," he said. "I accept it." The children grew in the particular fascinating way that children grow when they are loved and attended to and challenged, becoming more entirely themselves with each year. Daniel, at 12, was his father's right hand on the ranch and his mother's first reader for her letters and essays, a combination that produced a young person who was practical about the physical world and precise about the written word, and who had already a moral seriousness that occasionally surprised adults who expected less of him. Rose, at 10, had begun to write her own stories, small narratives about horses and weather, and the people she observed with her father's watching eyes, and Hazel read them carefully and honestly, and told her exactly what worked and what didn't, which Rose received with the equanimity of someone who expects honest feedback rather than empty praise. Samuel, at 3, was a force of nature who Hazel was increasingly convinced would either run something important or cause everyone around him a great deal of productive trouble, and she was at peace with either outcome. The years turned, as years do when a life is full and real and rooted. The 90s brought changes to the territory and state, the usual slow changes of a frontier becoming settled, the gradual arrival of more people, the building of more permanent things, the slow erosion of the particular wildness that had characterized the country when Hazel had ridden into it on a stormy Thursday evening in 1882 with $32 sewn into her hem and nowhere specific to go. She still thought about that evening sometimes. She thought about it when she looked at the bookshelf against the south wall under the light, when she looked at Timothy over the supper table with the children around it, when she walked the rise above the creek in the evening and looked down at the house below, their house, the one he had planned and built, the one she had filled with books and children and noise and the particular quality of a life lived on purpose. She thought about the barn. She thought about the man in the hay with his hat over his face, and her voice saying this is ridiculous, and his eyes coming out from under the hat, and the way they had looked at her in the lamplight. She thought about the conversation that had gone on until nearly 1 in the morning, and the way the rain had sounded on the roof, and the first moment she had understood that something was happening that was outside her ordinary experience. She still had that tin box with her teaching certificate and her mother's photograph, and the first letter he had ever written her was in it, the careful handwriting, and come October I expect to ride through, and it had stayed in the box through every move and every year, preserved as the thing it was, the beginning of everything. On the evening of their 12th wedding anniversary, Timothy found her on the rise above the creek, which was where he often found her when she needed to think, standing in the fading April light with her hands in the pockets of her coat, looking down at the house below where lamplight showed through the south window, and the sound of Daniel and Samuel arguing about something and Rose's voice cutting through with crisp authority drifted up to her on the evening air. He came and stood beside her and looked at the same view. 12 years, he said. 12 years, she agreed. Are you thinking about Harlan's Crossing? He asked. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the quiet dark eyes that still, 12 years on, had the same quality of clear, attentive warmth that had first caught her in a stormy boarding house and never let her go. How did you know? She said. Because you always get that particular expression on your face when you're thinking about the beginning, he said. Like you're checking something. Checking what? Whether it was as good as you remember. She looked at him for a moment. Was it better? He said. I remember thinking you were extraordinary and I had no right to be thinking it. I remember being grateful for the storm. You were grateful for the storm, she said. It put you somewhere I could find you, he said. She laughed. Down below, the argument between Daniel and Samuel reached some resolution, or at least a ceasefire, and then Rose's voice again. And the house was lit and warm, and the creek ran in the low ground and the hills above it were going dark blue in the last of the light. And the smell of supper was already coming from the kitchen where she had put a pot on before coming out. Come on, she said, taking his arm. Supper's going to burn. We have 5 more minutes before it burns, he said. You don't know that. I know the stove and I know the pot and I know how long you left it, he said. And he was right, as he was more often right about the practical details of their household than either of them had expected when they first began sharing one. They stood for those 5 minutes and looked at the house below and the hills above and the wide Wyoming sky going from gold to blue to dark, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had done for 12 years, and he put his arm around her the way he had done for 12 years, and neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying. Then she said, You know what I tell my students? Tell me, he said. I tell them that the most important thing you can do in a classroom or in a life is pay attention, that most of the things worth knowing are visible if you pay attention. He waited. You were paying attention, she said. That night in the barn, you had just come in from a storm and you didn't know me and you could have just said good night and gone to sleep in that hay and thought nothing of it, but you were paying attention. He was quiet for a moment. So were you, he said. You came out to the barn. This is ridiculous, she said, quoting herself. The most important 4 words anyone has ever said to me, he said. She laughed, the full warm laugh that belonged entirely to the Hazel she had become in this place, on this land, in this life, the laugh that her students heard and that her children had grown up with and that Timothy had, from the very first time he heard it in a Wyoming barn in 1882, thought was the finest sound in the world. They went down from the rise to the house, and she went to the stove and stirred the pot, which was not burning, as he had known it would not be. And he came in behind her, and the children descended on them with the various urgent matters of their day. Daniel with a question about the north fence that needed an answer before tomorrow. Rose with a chapter she had written that needed reading. Samuel with a conviction that he had seen a hawk in the barn that morning, and that this was significant and required acknowledgement. And the kitchen filled up with voices, and the pot steamed on the stove, and the lamp burned on the table, and outside the Wyoming night came down clear and full of stars, the kind of stars that only exist over open country, thick and brilliant, and so present they seemed to lean toward the earth. Hazel ladled stew into bowls, and Timothy poured water, and Daniel set the table with the efficiency of a 12-year-old who has done it enough times to stop thinking about it. And Samuel climbed into his chair and immediately began talking about the hawk again. And Rose spread her new chapter on the end of the table away from the food and looked at it with critical eyes while she waited. They sat down together, the 5 of them, around the table in the house by the creek 2 miles south of Eastbrook, Wyoming, in the spring of 1896, and they ate their supper together the way they had done for years and would do for many years more, in the easy full noise of a family that was entirely itself. and outside the stars went on burning over the plains as they had always done, indifferent and magnificent, as the world moved through its ordinary, extraordinary night. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Hazel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and the lamp turned low, reading through Rose's new chapter, which was better than the previous one in precisely the ways she had suggested after the previous one, which told her something very good about her daughter's ability to hear criticism and use it rather than simply survive it. Timothy sat across from her with his own cup, reading the ranch ledger the way he did most evenings, checking the numbers with the careful attention of a man who understood that the difference between a ranch that survived hard years and one that did not was usually found in the details. It was entirely ordinary. It was entirely wonderful. She looked up from Rose's page and looked at him, and he felt her looking the way he always did and raised his eyes from the ledger. "Good?" he asked, meaning the chapter. "Very good," she said. "She is going to write real things one day." He nodded, with the particular satisfaction of a parent hearing good things about his child. "And the fence in the north pasture needs new posts in 3 places," he said. "Daniel noticed it before I did." "He's turning into you," she said. "He's turning into himself," Timothy said. "We're just the material he's working from." She smiled and went back to the chapter, and he went back to the ledger, and the lamp burned low between them, and the house settled around them in the quiet of a spring night in Wyoming, solid and real and theirs. And the creek ran outside, and the stars burned above, and the land they had made into a life went on in every direction, steady and enduring and alive. The way good things are when they are built with care and honesty, and the kind of love that does not ask to be rewarded but simply continues. Morning after morning, year after year, choosing itself again and again in the ordinary, extraordinary days of a life that is, by any honest measure, more than enough. She finished the chapter and set it down and took a sip of her tea, cool now, and thought about a woman on a horse in a rainstorm, $32 in her hem, nowhere particular to go, riding into a settlement called Harlan's Crossing, and pushing through a door into warmth and smoke and finding, without knowing she was looking for it, the single door that was going to open into everything else. She thought about a man in hay, hat over his face, who had looked up and paid attention. She thought about the barn and the rain, and this is ridiculous, and the long road to the canyon junction, and the letter that said come October, and the Sunday mornings with bread from a cast iron skillet, and the rise above the creek in the snow, and I've been in love with you since you walked into that barn, and 12 years of supper tables and difficult seasons and children's voices and the bookshelf under the south window with all the light she would ever need. She thought about how a life begins not in the grand gestures but in the small ones, in the choice to give up a bed, in the choice to walk out into the rain, in the choice to say what you mean and stay where you are and pay attention. She looked at Timothy Covington across the table, this man she loved, and she thought that she had come a very long distance on a very hard road to find herself exactly here, and that here was the finest place she had ever been. He looked up and found her watching him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He studied her for a moment with those quiet dark eyes that saw her exactly and always had, and then he said, "Come to bed, Hazel. The ledger will keep." "It will keep," she agreed. She put out the lamp and they went together down the hall of their house, past the closed doors where their children slept, past the bookshelf in the front room that held everything she had ever thought was important, and outside the Wyoming night held them gently in the dark, and the creek ran, and the stars burned, and it was all exactly as it should be.